นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. When I first entered the monastery in northeast Thailand, one of the first things you're taught, even as an anagarika, white-robed postulant monk keeping 8 precepts, is how to bow. Luang Por Chah emphasized bowing as an important part of the practice. There's 2 aspects to bowing. One is the physical act of inclining your body down to the ground, say in front of the Buddha statue or a teacher. The other is inclining your mind. Inclining your mind, literally bending your mind towards that which is good, valuable, worthy of admiration, worthy of emulation, those qualities that we aspire to. And the monks would train the newcomers in how to bow properly, what they call the five-point prostration, where you go down on your knees, put your hands together in Anjali, your palms together in front of you, and then you go down, bow your back down onto the ground, and the 5 points are your elbows, the palms of your hands, and then your forehead touching the ground between the palms. And the idea is to keep your back straight as well. So some people, especially when you're young, find it easier to do that. Those who get older, who come from a culture where they've never bowed before, may find it challenging, certainly at first. But because it's a part of the practice not just on the outside but on the inside, most people living in a monastery come to appreciate it. Because when you bow, you're physically stopping for a moment, you pause. So you're taught to bow when you come into the meditation hall, before you leave, when you come into the presence of your teacher, say a senior monk. Even when you go back to your hut in the forest, you bow. Maybe you have a picture of a teacher or the Buddha, you bow. And before you leave your hut, you bow before you come out to go somewhere else. So you bow a lot. And each time you're pausing, you're putting your own mental chatter and activities on pause, because it takes a moment, even if you bow fast, and some people do when they're in a hurry, but they still bow. So you stop your physical activity and bow, and then the idea is you're also establishing mindfulness, recollecting or keeping in mind Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So it can bring up very wholesome states of mind or interrupt a stream of unskillful thinking, you're caught into a mood of distraction, worry, anger, craving, can interrupt that, can bring up the reflection or recollection of that which is good, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, teachers, qualities of the Dhamma. Ajahn Chah said if you really bow with full mindfulness and knowledge of what you're doing at that moment, it can even bring tears to your eyes. You're remembering the Buddha, the qualities of the Buddha, what we call the Bharami, the 10 Bharami or the 30 Bharami, because the Buddha makes his Bharami on a deeper level than everyone else. We say 30 points of Bharami, so that's an ordinary level, and then on the intermediate level, and then on the highest, ultimate level of Bharami, complete sacrifice for Nibbana and for teaching other beings. So if you recollect that, the qualities of the Buddha when you bow, it can bring tears to your eyes, can bring up joy, rapture, tends to bring up gratitude to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha. Somebody once asked Rinpoche, does the Buddha himself bow to anyone? And he said the Buddha bows to the Dhamma. So even the Dhamma, even though it's an impersonal thing, it's the truth, the way things are. The Dhamma is not a person, but it's still something you can bow to. You can bow to the truth. And that includes the path of practice that leads you to realizing truth. So the Buddha bows to that. Even the Buddha bows to something. Of course, when we're new to Buddhism, or particularly new to a Buddhist monastery, then bowing can seem strange or unfamiliar, especially if you're living in a country that doesn't have Buddhist culture as its background. There may be Buddhists living in a country or society, but if they're not the majority, then something like bowing can be quite unusual. So if you come into a monastery and see other people bowing, combined with other things like chanting, ritual, some people find it off-putting. They feel awkward or embarrassed because they don't know what they're doing or what it all means, or they just don't like it at first. That's understandable. One of the laymen who became an anagarika with me once complained to me when I was in the monastery in Thailand. He said, "Oh, I must have bowed over 50 times today. My knees hurt, my back hurts. Why do we have to bow so much?" Which may be a typical reaction of many. So it's the culture of the monastery and monastic training, especially as Ajahn Chah encouraged, may be a bit different from surrounding culture of society, where bowing may be seen in a negative light, seen as a sign of weakness. You're bowing to somebody showing you're weak. And our culture tends to promote self, being strong, confident, not giving in to anyone, being independent. Bowing may be seen as kowtowing to some higher being which you don't accept or don't want to accept. And of course, some people see bowing to a statue as idol worship. Some religions see that as blasphemy as well. Because in the time of the Buddha, they had no statues, and the Buddha didn't want them to make statues. So any form of bowing or physical respect was taught as something where you're really recollecting these qualities, you're respecting the qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. And that's how it should be. Even though physically is an act that may be a little bit out of sync with the rest of society, if you focus on the mental qualities that you're aspiring to at that moment, these are things that most people would agree are good. So aspiring to compassion, kindness, aspiring to develop wisdom, understanding, mindfulness, peace, all the many different qualities that a Buddha or a well-practiced student of the Buddha, enlightened Sangha, represent or symbolize. You're bowing to those qualities. After the Buddha, we've had, particularly under the influence of the Greeks, who had a culture with statues and liked to make statues, coming into India. Then they started making Buddha statues. So now we have Buddha statues everywhere. But the aim is to use them skillfully, to bring up these qualities, and we say incline your mind towards the qualities of the Buddha, say the Bharami and the different qualities of the Buddha as the first teacher, but also Sangha, those who have practiced well and realized the Dhamma after the Buddha. You bow and you incline your mind towards cultivating those same qualities and the same realization as Buddha or the enlightened Sangha. Of course, statues can be used in different ways, so now we have statues in Bunnings. You have statues in garden centres, people's yard, people's coffee table, even in bars. People will have Buddha statues because it tends to be associated with feel good. You feel good seeing the Buddha's face or statue. So maybe still something vaguely skillful, but often not really in a place where it's encouraging respect. Even then, in Buddhism we don't have a culture of persecuting heretics. Buddhists, the Buddha didn't encourage us to become angry and fight people who don't believe in the Buddha's teachings or who even disrespect the Buddha's teachings. So if someone doesn't bow to a statue, if you're following what the Buddha taught, there's no need to get angry or get upset with them. You understand. Maybe they're a very good person, they have very good qualities and aspire to the same things that you do. But perhaps they are just not familiar with bowing and Buddhist rituals. And we don't ostracize or persecute people who are, you might call, non-believers. You just get on with your practice as a Buddhist. And if other people are interested and believe, well, that's good. Maybe you can share what you know with them if they ask, if they're interested. If they don't, that doesn't matter. Let them get on with whatever they're doing. So it's natural when people come into a monastery, they have different reactions. Sometimes it's just the unusual, the strangeness of it, the out of ordinariness of it brings up different reactions. They like it, they don't like it, they're interested, they're bored. Boredom is a very common first reaction to a monastery where it's very quiet, not much happens, the routine is very repetitive. Some always have the meal at the same time, same kind of chanting, same kind of meditation is always quiet, even walking meditation is quiet. Even when people in monasteries do some kind of work, activity tends to be fairly simple, quiet activities. There's no entertainments, there's no music, there's no kind of, not many distractions. So boredom is often a first reaction. And it's just highlighting how used we are to stimulation out in the world. The Buddhist monastery is a place, often it's like here, it's a very quiet forest environment. It's set up to help support you seeing your mind. We do have a Buddha statue to remind us of the qualities of the Buddha and the teachings of the Buddha. But that's about as distracting as it gets. So you may have your first reaction, you like the statue, or you don't. Or sometimes people ask, what does the statue mean, the posture? Because different statues will have different postures. So the one behind me is standing, and the Buddha's holding up both hands. And there's a little Dhammacakka wheel inside the hands of the Buddha. So people say, why is the Buddha holding up his hands? They say, well, the Buddha is teaching in this statue. It symbolizes the Buddha teaching the Dhamma, hence the Dhammacakka wheel in his hand. And obviously the Buddha is remembered for his teaching, out of compassion, teaching people the way to liberate themselves from suffering. But that's as exciting and stimulating as it gets. And people sometimes say, well, the Buddha's face is peaceful, or they like it, or they don't. They like the artwork, or they don't. The colour. But once you've seen the statue once or twice, that's about it. You don't need to think too much about it or doubt about it. This statue in particular, it's the same mudra as in Ajahn Chah's monastery in Thailand. So somebody once asked Ajahn Chah, why has the Buddha got two hands up? Because sometimes you see the Buddha with just one hand, blessing people with one hand. Why has this one got two hands? And Ajahn Chah said, because people nowadays are so thick-skinned and so stubborn, one hand isn't enough, you need two hands. But that's about as exciting as it gets. The Buddha statue, the other statues and ornaments on a shrine. And a meditation room like this is completely bare, empty. You have meditation mats, there's not even much furniture, not much else. Because the monastery is designed to be a simple environment to help turn your attention inwards so that you can develop some of these qualities that the Buddha was encouraging us to develop to help us free our minds from suffering. If you go out into the world, if you're going somewhere public, whether it's a shopping mall or some kind of place that people go, there'll tend to be all kinds of distractions. Advertising, decorations, and then of course if it's anywhere where there's people, there'll be things being sold, shops, stores, department stores. The very opposite of a monastery, because out there in the world people tend to be following their desires a lot more, and the way of the world is based on desire and attachment. So desire is endless. There's a famous teaching the Buddha gave, Nati Danha Samanati. There's no river as long as the river of desire, meaning it's just endless. So say you go somewhere where there's shops, well, there's always new products, new lines, new fashion, new designs of things that we buy and sell in the world. Big things, little things, food, clothing, vehicles, technology, phones, and so on. Everything. It's endless. The new designs, new products we produce. The Buddha encouraged us to look more deeply at it. So it's hard out there in society because there is so much and there's always new stuff. But still the Buddha encouraged us to look more closely. You see, the driving force is desire. Desire backed by greed, particularly greed for pleasure, wealth, status, power, influence, reputation. The various things that humans seek after. If you follow it back, reduce it back down, it's really just greed, endless greed, fuels endless production and design of new things, products, material things, experiences, and so on. So when you come into a monastery, suddenly all that is gone. You have a little bit of new stuff. You have maybe a new statue, for a while it's new. A new building, for a while it's new, but not much. So of course your mind is looking to settle down on whatever is new or whatever is stimulating. The idea is you look around for a while and then you realize there's not much to be found in a monastery in the way of stimulating your greed. So then hopefully you can let go of some of your greed and your mind settles down and maybe turns inwards. That's why a monastery is a good place for meditation. But you may have to go through a process where you're shedding or letting go of your normal obsession and thinking about life, work, family, buying things, travelling, etc. It takes a while to settle all that down. And once you have set it aside, you're in the monastery, then you can turn inwards and really go to the source of this greed and this endless desire that constantly affects us. And your mind, having looked around for things to distract you, maybe after a while it's tired of that, so that it's settled down and you can get deeper into your meditation. And the monastery is helpful with that. For that. You can do it outside the monastery, of course, but you need a bit more discipline because there's more distraction. And many people come into a monastery, they do have experienced the sort of the tiredness of the world. They've been there, done that. People who maybe have travelled a lot realise in the end every country is much the same. People, the same everywhere. Buildings, airports. There's differences, but the differences maybe outweighed by the similarities. And so somebody who's travelled a lot maybe reach a point where they say, oh, don't really need to travel anymore. I've seen it all, been there, done that. So they tire of travelling, or it could be just the whole cycle of earning money, working, till they get tired of that. Having family, bringing up kids, get tired of that. Kids grow up, go away. So people do get to the point where they're kind of tired of the world, and then they may come into a monastery and learn meditation, learn some of the reflections that the Buddha gave and the techniques, practice, learn to follow precepts, 5 precepts, 8 precepts. A few people, maybe a small number even, are really tired of the world and ready to go on to train to become a Buddhist monk or nun. And the best way to prepare for ordination is actually to be tired of the world, because then you have less doubts, less curiosity about the world. But it's not the only way. Say in a Buddhist country like Thailand, it's not a small number of monks who actually entered the monkhood as novice monks when they were just kids, 12 years old or 15 years old. They've experienced relatively little of the world, didn't go out to get a job with a salary, didn't have a family, didn't have kids, maybe didn't travel much around the world, entered the monastery at a very young age, but because they had faith and their faith continued, and they didn't get caught up in doubt or distraction to go out into the world, faith kept them practicing, going into the robes as monks and maybe staying their whole life as monks. There are those monks you meet. The ones who come into the monastery because they're tired, you could say that's coming from insight. So maybe wisdom, seeing some of the disadvantages of living in the world, working, earning money, dealing with family and things. Insight says, oh, where's this all going? And maybe recognises that it is tiring and maybe not that fruitful. Those who come into the monastery at a young age, maybe they're coming just from faith. They don't fully know yet, but their wisdom, insight grows later with experience in the practice. But the idea is that faith and wisdom are 2 qualities we develop, and over time they support each other. So whether you entered the monastery or began practicing Buddhism at a young age or at a ripe old age, the idea is that faith and wisdom keep you practicing, and ultimately they merge. You can see that even with something as simple as bowing. You may bow in the beginning out of faith in the Buddha or a teacher, but later, as insight and wisdom develops, maybe your bow is mixed with truly recognizing the goodness of what you're practicing, and those qualities you're actually realizing or experiencing them in your mind for yourself. Or some people come from this place of being tired with the world, and their mind is sort of turning away from the world towards the spiritual life. And then having practiced for a while, they realize what the Buddha was teaching is true, and their faith grows afterwards. And afterwards, through the practice, then their faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha grows deeper. Either way, the aim is that as you practice, your wisdom, your faith deepens and deepens. until you are actually, your mind is seeing the Dhamma and living with the Dhamma and realizing the Dhamma. You're no longer just acting out of faith alone. You're also acting out of seeing the Dhamma, knowing the Dhamma. What's interesting is to say, like monks and nuns who become enlightened, they don't say stop bowing, from what I can see. They carry on just as before, but maybe the quality of mind behind the bow has changed. Or if they're physically limited by age, perhaps they have mobility issues, they bow a bit worse than before or less than before. But they still bow. Some people even die bowing. Luang Por Sao is the teacher of Luang Por Man. Luang Por Man is sitting up on the shrine behind me. His teacher, Luang Por Sao, was considered to be enlightened. And he came back to his monastery to die when he was very ill at the end of his life. He'd been elsewhere and the monks brought him home, as it were. And they thought when he arrived at his monastery that he'd want to go straight to his hut for a rest. He said, take me to the main hall to bow to the Buddha statue. This is one of the practices monks do when they arrive in the monastery. Often the first thing they'll do is go to the main Buddha statue and bow, even chant sometimes, before they go to their accommodation, say. So Luang Por Sao, very old, very weak, very sick. Still, that's what he wanted to do. Partly his training, partly that's just the way his mind was. He was inclining towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha all the time. One who has realized the Dhamma, they're just as if with the Buddha, with the Dhamma, the Sangha all the time. And the bow is an outward expression of that. So he went to the hall, he bowed once, and then he didn't get up. He didn't move out of that position. And the monks, looking after him, waited patiently, respectfully for him to get up from his bow, but he didn't. And then he went up and checked his breath, and he had been very weak, so they knew he was very close to the end. And then they realized, he stopped breathing, he's actually died in the bowing posture. Some monks, if they're strong enough, they get up, they die sitting meditation. Luang Por Sao died bowing to the Buddha. And as long as a monk can still move around, well, they'll tend to still lift their hands in Anjali to acknowledge another monk, or acknowledge the Buddha, or just to acknowledge a good act that someone has done. They might lift their hands in Anjali. If they're really strong enough, they might still bow, even to the very last day of their life, and bow. So it's not like, say, you become the enlightened monk or nun person, that you say, I'm enlightened now, no need to bow. They still tend to bow. Just as the rules of practice, the rules of training, say for an arahant, an enlightened person, they don't discard them. The Buddha kept following the way of practice and the rules of training, even kept meditating when he was enlightened. Same with Ajahn Chah or any other teacher that we believe to be enlightened. They keep the same rules, do the same practices right to the end. And they may have physical limitations, but they carry on practicing according to what they can Kalyano was another teacher Luang Por Chah praised. He lived in a city temple in Bangkok. It wasn't ideal surroundings for meditation and becoming enlightened, but he had enough discipline and enough determination in his practice to do that. He carried on bowing, chanting, sitting and walking meditation right to the end of his life. And he never missed one session of chanting meditation in the monastery except for the very last day of his life, when he was too weak to walk to the hall for the chanting session. So everyone knew, he must be very ill because he didn't turn up, because he hadn't missed one before that. He died of cancer that day because he wasn't able to go to the hall, so everyone knew he must be very sick. So the monks went to visit him and found that he died. Sometimes people think, when you're enlightened then you don't have to do anything else. Well, mentally maybe that's true. There's no more desire to let go of, no more wanting or greed to let go of. It's all gone. But enlightened beings still display their enlightenment in their behavior. So they are still keeping precepts, as it were, practicing mindfulness, as it were. They don't stop practicing. It's just the nature of the mind and the realization behind the practice changes. They're no longer practicing because they need to practice to realize the Dhamma. They've realized the Dhamma. Then they're practicing more out of compassion for others, being a good example, and more out of respect, gratitude to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. So there's a few reflections on some aspects of monastic life, bowing, the Dhamma. I'll leave them with you for your contemplation tonight.